In a quiet, unassuming town nestled on the edge of sprawling, whispering woods, time seemed to flow differently. Days bled into nights with a languid rhythm, the kind that lulled its residents into a life of quiet predictability. But, for those who had lived there long enough, there was an unspoken understanding about the woods. A knowledge passed down through hushed voices and cautious looks. The woods were not ordinary. On rare nights, when the blood moon rose in the sky, painting the world in a haunting shade of crimson, the woods came alive with a legend as old as the town itself. The air would grow so still that even the cicadas fell silent, and the world seemed suspended in an eerie hush. It was on these nights that the faint whistle of a locomotive could be heard, echoing faintly from the depths of the forest. This was no ordinary train. Locals called it the midnight train to nowhere. The train wasn't part of any railway network, nor did it follow the schedules of ordinary locomotives. It was said to emerge from a place where time and reality twisted upon themselves, appearing only for those burdened by the weight of their lives, those who were lost in purpose, lost in life, lost in soul. But there was a price. For anyone who stepped aboard the train, there was no return. No one knew exactly when the legend began. Some believed it was tied to an old railway line that had been decommissioned decades ago, its tracks swallowed by the ever-hungry forest. Others whispered of something darker, something supernatural, an entity that fed on human despair. The train's whistle wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling. Those who claimed to have heard it described an ache deep within their chests, as though the sound resonated in the very marrow of their bones. It wasn't merely a call. It was a promise. For some, it promised escape, a way out of lives marred by grief, regret, or emptiness. For others, it was a haunting reminder of everything they wished to forget. But for everyone, it was irresistible. The people of the town had learned to live with the legend. On the nights of the blood moon, doors were locked, windows shuttered, and prayers whispered. Children were told stories of the train, cautionary tales to keep them from wandering into the woods. But it wasn't just children who needed to be wary. The train didn't discriminate. It came for anyone it deemed lost, no matter their age, their status, or their beliefs. And when it called, no amount of logic or fear could hold someone back. The forest itself seemed complicit. On those nights, it became a different place entirely, its usual charm replaced by an oppressive stillness. The trees whispered secrets to one another, their leaves rustling even in the absence of wind. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, and paths that were familiar by day twisted and turned, leading nowhere. And then there was the whistle. It began faintly, almost imperceptibly, but it grew louder with every passing moment. For those who heard it, it was like a voice, calling their name, beckoning them into the unknown. One such blood moon rose higher than ever before, its crimson glow bathing the town in an otherworldly light. The streets were empty, the townsfolk hidden behind locked doors, their homes dim and silent. Even the animals seemed to sense the change, their usual nocturnal sounds replaced by an uneasy quiet. Deep in the woods, the whistle began to blow. It carried with it a strange melody, haunting and beautiful, like the cry of a lonely soul. For those who were awake, the sound was impossible to ignore. It seemed to seep into the cracks of their minds, stirring memories, regrets, and yearnings they thought they had buried long ago. Somewhere in the town, a figure stirred, unable to resist the pull of the whistle. They didn't know why they were drawn to it, only that they had to follow. The promise of the train wasn't just escape. It was understanding, resolution, an answer to the questions that haunted their restless nights. And so they stepped out into the crimson night, their silhouettes swallowed by the shadows of the whispering woods. As the blood moon cast its eerie crimson light over the whispering woods, a figure emerged from the quiet town. Amelia, just 22, was drawn by a sound she couldn't explain, a faint whistle that stirred something deep within her. It wasn't just curiosity that compelled her steps. It was a pull a magnetic force that seemed to tug at the empty spaces in her soul. Amelia had recently returned to her childhood home, a weathered house on the edge of the woods. Her father's passing had brought her back, but grief had hollowed her out, leaving her adrift. The town, once a place of warm memories, now felt suffocating. Friends had moved on, her mother was distant, and her nights were spent wandering the forest trails, searching for a solace she couldn't define. On this night, under the blood moon's haunting glow, her aimless wandering had taken her further than ever before. The air grew colder, and the familiar trails seemed to twist and shift as if the forest itself were guiding her. The whistle grew louder, its mournful call resonating in her chest like a second heartbeat. Breaking through the dense foliage, Amelia found herself in a clearing she had never seen before. Moonlight bathed the space in red and gold, revealing the ghostly remains of train tracks that stretched into the shadows. They looked ancient, rusted and broken in places, like the exposed bones of some long-dead creature. But tonight, the tracks weren't abandoned. In the center of the clearing stood a sleek black train, its surface gleaming like obsidian. The windows glowed faintly, casting a warm, golden light that felt oddly inviting, yet deeply unsettling. The engine emitted a low, rhythmic hum, almost like breathing. Amelia froze, her breath hitching in her throat. She had heard the stories as a child, the tales of the midnight train to nowhere. She had dismissed them as folklore, the kind of thing parents told to keep children from wandering too far into the woods. Yet here it was, impossibly real, and waiting. As Amelia's feet moved of their own accord, carrying her closer to the train, the sound of a door sliding open broke the heavy silence. A figure stepped out. A man dressed in an impeccably pressed conductor's uniform. His presence was unnerving, like something out of a fever dream. His face was pale, unnaturally smooth, almost wax-like, with a shine that caught the moonlight. His eyes glinted black, reflective and depthless, like polished obsidian. When he spoke, his voice was sharp and hollow, each word echoing as if carried from a cavern deep beneath the earth.
"Ticket?"
he asked, tilting his head slightly. Amelia blinked, her voice faltering as she responded.
I don't have one."
The conductor's lips curled into a thin smile, though it didn't reach his eyes.
"You are the ticket,"
he replied, stepping aside and motioning her toward the open door. Amelia hesitated, her hand hovering over the cold iron railing of the steps. The train seemed to hum louder, its golden windows flickering as though alive, beckoning her inside. She glanced back at the forest, the path she had taken now shrouded in shadows. A wave of memories washed over her. The loneliness of the past months, the ache of her father's absence, the feeling of being unmoored in her own life. It was as if the train could see into her, into the cracks and fractures of her soul.
"You've been searching for something, haven't you?"
The conductor said, his voice softer now, almost understanding.
"A place to belong, an answer to the question that keeps you awake at night."
Amelia's chest tightened. How did he know? She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. The conductor extended a pale hand, his gaze steady and unyielding.
"The train goes where you need it to go,"
he said.
"But the destination is not what you expect."
The forest seemed to hold its breath as Amelia made her decision. Her hand gripped the railing, the metal cold against her skin. With a final glance at the world she was leaving behind, she stepped onto the first step of the train. The hum of the engine grew louder, almost triumphant. As the door slid shut behind her, the last thing she saw was the conductor's enigmatic smile. Inside, the air was warm and rich, scented faintly with something familiar yet unplaceable. The interior glowed with soft golden light, casting long shadows that danced across the polished floors. Amelia's heart pounded in her chest. She had no idea where the train was taking her or if she would ever return. But for the first time in months, she felt something stir within her. A spark of curiosity, of possibility. As the train lurched forward, the whistle blew once more, its haunting call echoing through the forest. And with that, the midnight train to nowhere disappeared into the night, leaving nothing but silence and the faint scent of smoke in its wake. The door hissed shut behind Amelia with a finality that sent a chill down her spine. She turned to look back, but there was no longer any sign of the woods or the crimson glow of the blood moon. Instead, the world outside the train seemed to blur and twist, as if reality itself had unraveled into a canvas smeared with shadows and light. The air inside the train was thick, carrying a strange, almost electric scent. Ozone mixed with something faintly putrid, like decaying leaves after a storm. Amelia's breath hitched as she took in her surroundings. The walls shimmered like liquid shadows, their surfaces appearing solid one moment and rippling the next, as though alive. The faint golden light that had seemed inviting from outside now felt oppressive, casting strange, flickering patterns across the narrow corridor. As she moved cautiously through the train, she passed compartments with glass doors slightly ajar. Each room held a strange frozen scene, like twisted vignettes plucked from a nightmare. In one, a man sat at a table, his head tilted back in laughter, but the longer Amelia looked, the more his expression twisted, his face contorting into a mask of terror. The soundless scream, etched into his features, made her skin crawl. In another compartment, a woman sat with a cup of tea in her hands. Her movements were repetitive, mechanical, stirring the tea in endless circles. The liquid never spilled, never cooled, never emptied. Her eyes were vacant, staring at nothing, yet they seemed to follow Amelia as she passed. Then there was the child. A small boy sat by a window, his finger tracing shapes in the fogged glass. Triangles, circles, and spirals appeared briefly before vanishing into the mist. He didn't look up, but Amelia felt his presence keenly, as though he were aware of her but chose to ignore her entirely. The deeper she ventured, the more oppressive the train became. It wasn't just the scenes in the compartments, it was the feeling. The walls seemed to pulse with a rhythm that wasn't her own, as though the train itself was alive, aware of her intrusion. Suddenly the train lurched. Amelia grabbed onto the nearest wall for support, expecting the familiar forward motion of a locomotive. But this train didn't move forward. Instead, it slid sideways, like a skater gliding across a frozen lake. She glanced out the window and gasped. The forest outside had transformed. The trees were no longer trees. They had become grotesque, spindly hands clawing at the glass. Their elongated branches twisted unnaturally, their movements slow and deliberate, as if they were alive and reaching for her. The train wasn't traveling through the woods anymore. It was slipping between something, gliding along the frayed edges of reality. Without realizing how she'd got there, Amelia found herself seated in a plush chair in what appeared to be a lounge car. The seat was impossibly soft, its dark upholstery patterned with shifting, iridescent feathers. Across from her sat an old woman, draped in a cloak made entirely of feathers that shimmered in the golden light. Her face was lined with deep wrinkles, her eyes sharp and piercing, like a bird of prey. She held a gnarled staff in her hands, its top adorned with what looked like a glowing, blackened crystal.
"What did you come here, child?"
the woman asked, her voice a strange blend of pity and warning. Amelia opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Why had she come? Was it the whistle that had called to her? The weight of her father's absence? The suffocating loneliness that had taken root in her chest?
I don't know,
she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The old woman's gaze softened, but her expression grew more somber. She leaned forward, her cloak rustling like the wings of 1,000 birds.
Then you may never leave,
she said, her voice low and ominous. Amelia's heart sank, a cold dread spreading through her. Never leave? She echoed.
unless you find what you've lost.
Amelia's mind raced. What had she lost? Her father, certainly. But he was gone, beyond her reach. Was it more than that? Was it something she had lost long before she even realized it was missing? The train's hum grew louder, almost as if it were reacting to the woman's words. The shadows on the walls rippled, and the faint scent of decay intensified.
What do you mean?
Amelia asked, her voice trembling.
What have I lost?
The old woman didn't answer. Instead, she leaned back into her chair, her expression unreadable. The train jolted again, the movement more violent this time, and the windows went dark. Amelia was left staring into the void, her reflection faintly visible in the black glass, but as she looked closer, she realized the reflection wasn't hers. The train screeched to a halt with such force that Amelia was thrown forward, her hands instinctively bracing against the shimmering wall. The humming ceased, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed against her ears like static. She rose slowly, her heart pounding in her chest as she steadied herself. Peering through the fogged window, she froze. There was her childhood home, but not the one she remembered. This version of the house was wrong. The white paint that once gleamed in the sunlight was now cracked and peeling, exposing rotted wood beneath. The garden, which her father had lovingly tended, was now a tangled mess of weeds and thorny vines. Above, the sky churned with black, pulsating clouds that seemed alive, pulsating with an unnatural energy. The train's door creaked open, the sound echoing through the car like a groan. Amelia turned sharply, her breath catching as the conductor appeared in the doorway.
"Your stop,"
he said. But the voice wasn't his anymore. It was her father's. Deep, warm, and achingly familiar. Her legs felt heavy, but something beyond her control pushed her forward. The conductor's dark eyes glinted as he stepped aside, allowing her to pass. The moment Amelia's feet touched the ground, the air grew dense, heavy with the stench of mildew and something far worse. Her stomach churned as she hesitated at the overgrown path leading to the door.
"Amelia?"
Her father's voice called to her, faint at first, then louder, echoing from within the house. It wasn't the warm, comforting tone she remembered. It was strained, laced with sorrow and pain. She called back, her voice trembling. The door to the house creaked open slowly, as if beckoning her inside. She hesitated, her instincts screaming for her to turn back, to run, but the pull was too strong. She stepped inside, her heart pounding with each reluctant step. The interior of the house was suffocating. The air was thick, damp, and freezing cold. The walls were covered in a strange, black mold that seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. Shadows gathered in the corners, moving unnaturally, as if they were watching her. The smell was worse inside, a sickly sweet rot that clung to her senses. She covered her nose and pressed on, following the sound of her father's voice. She found him in the living room, sitting in his favorite armchair. The room was dim, the only light coming from the flickering glow of a phantom fireplace. Her father's face was obscured by shadow, but she recognized the way he sat. His shoulders hunched, his hands resting on the chair's worn arms, just as he always had when he came home from work. "Dad," she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. He didn't move at first, didn't even acknowledge her presence. Then, slowly, his head turned toward her, and his voice broke the silence.
"Oh, didn't you save me, Amelia?"
He rasped, his voice thick with sorrow and accusation. Each word struck her like a hammer, shattering the fragile wall she had built around her grief. She froze, her mind racing, guilt flooding in like a tidal wave.
I couldn't.
She stammered, her voice barely audible.
You were already gone.
His head tilted slightly, the shadow over his face deepening.
"You could have done more,"
he said, his tone sharp now, cutting through her like a blade.
"You should have been there."
Amelia's chest tightened as memories she had tried to bury surged to the surface. Her father had been sick for years, not in the way that was obvious, not with hospital beds or whispered diagnoses, but in a way that crept into their lives quietly, like a shadow growing longer at dusk. He had struggled with depression, though he had never spoken about it directly. Amelia remembered the way he would sit in that same chair for hours, staring at nothing, his once vivid eyes dull and distant. She had always told herself he just needed time, that he was strong enough to pull himself out of it. She hadn't understood how deep the darkness went. The night he died, Amelia had been out with friends. She had debated staying home. She had seen the way he had withdrawn even more that week. But the pull of escape, of pretending everything was fine, had been too strong. When she returned, the house was silent. Too silent. She had found him upstairs, the empty bottle of pills on the nightstand. She had replayed that night in her mind endlessly. If she had stayed, would it have made a difference? Could she have seen the signs earlier, reached out, done something to stop him? She blamed herself for not understanding, for not pushing harder when he brushed off her questions, for every moment she had chosen to focus on her own life instead of his struggles.
You should have been there,
he repeated now, his voice echoing with the weight of her own thoughts. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched her chest.
I didn't know how.
She sobbed.
I didn't know how to save you.
His form began to change as her words hung in the air. The shadow over him expanded, engulfing his body as it twisted and warped. His limbs elongated unnaturally, his hands becoming claw-like and skeletal. Hollow eyes burned with cold light as he rose from the chair, towering over her like a monstrous specter of her guilt. The creature lunged at her, its bony fingers reaching for her throat, but Amelia didn't run. She stood frozen, not just with fear, but with the unbearable weight of everything she had carried since that night. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her mind screaming for her to move, to flee, but she couldn't. The old woman's voice from the train echoed faintly in her mind. Find what you've lost. In this moment, she realized it wasn't just her father she had lost. She had lost herself, in the guilt, in the what-ifs and the regrets.
I'm sorry.
She screamed, her voice breaking.
I'm sorry I couldn't save you, but I loved you. I loved you so much.
The creature stopped, its hollow eyes flickering. The claws it had raised to strike faltered, its form trembling, as though her words had struck something deep within it. The burning light in its eyes dimmed, replaced by something softer, almost human. The shadows surrounding it began to peel away, fading into nothingness. In their place, for a brief moment, Amelia thought she saw her father's face. Not twisted in anger or pain, but peaceful, his eyes filled with an understanding that she had never given herself.
Let go,
he whispered, his voice tender now, carrying a faint echo of the man she remembered. It wasn't your fault. And then, like smoke in the wind, he was gone. The room dissolved around her, the phantom fireplace snuffed out, leaving her alone in the dim emptiness. She collapsed to her knees, her sobs shaking her body. But for the first time in years, the weight on her chest began to lift. The train, she realized, wasn't just about finding what you'd lost. It was about forgiving yourself for what you couldn't change. As terror consumed her, a voice echoed in her mind, cutting through the chaos. It was the old woman's voice, calm yet commanding. Find what you've lost. Amelia's eyes widened as the words struck her like a bolt of lightning. Through the haze of fear, she realized what she had to do.
I'm sorry.
She shouted, her voice breaking.
I'm sorry I couldn't save you, but I loved you. I loved you so much.
Her words hung in the air, trembling with raw emotion. The creature froze, its hollow eyes locking onto hers. Slowly, the light within them began to shift, softening into something warmer, something human. The room began to dissolve, the mold-covered walls and oppressive shadows melting away like ink in water. Her father's form returned, no longer monstrous, but heartbreakingly familiar. He looked at her one last time, his expression soft, almost grateful, before fading into the mist. Amelia blinked, her vision swimming as she realized she was no longer in the house. She was back on the train, seated in the same plush chair. Across from her, the old woman sat, her feathered cloak shimmering faintly in the golden light.
"You've faced your shadow,
The woman said, her voice tinged with approval.
but the train isn't done with you yet."
Amelia's hands trembled in her lap, her heart still racing. She wanted to ask what the woman meant, but the words wouldn't come. Outside the window, the void churned, and the train began to hum again, preparing for its next journey. The sharp whistle of the train pierced the silence, its sound mournful yet resolute, as if bidding farewell to something unseen. Amelia felt the subtle jolt as the train began to move once more, its sideways glide carrying her deeper into the unknown. Her breath fogged the glass as she leaned toward the window. The swirling black void she had glimpsed earlier had shifted. Now, through the murky darkness, she saw faint, flickering scenes unfolding at distant stops. The train slowed as it approached these destinations, but not for her. At each stop, she saw other passengers. The frozen man with the terrified laughter, the tea-stirring woman, even the child by the window, step off silently into their own personal trials. The vignettes outside were hauntingly vivid. A woman knelt in a crumbling cathedral, her sobs echoing in the emptiness as she reached for something just out of sight. A man stood in a rain-soaked alley, staring at a younger version of himself, who held a knife in trembling hands. Each stop held a unique agony, a glimpse into the shattered hearts and fractured minds of those aboard. One by one, they vanished. Each departure left the train quieter, lonelier. Amelia's chest tightened as she realized that soon it would be her turn. She hadn't noticed when the landscape began to change. The twisted void outside the train softened, colors bleeding back into the world like the slow rise of dawn. When she finally looked out the window again, her breath caught. It was her town. The familiar streets, the sloping roofs of houses, the flickering streetlights, all of it was there. But like her childhood home, it wasn't quite right. The streets seemed emptier, the colors washed out, as if the town itself were holding its breath. The train slowed to a crawl, its mournful whistle echoing one last time. Amelia's pulse quickened as the conductor appeared once more, his uniform immaculate, his expression unreadable.
"This is your stop,"
he said, his tone as flat and final as the slam of a door. Amelia hesitated, her hands gripping the armrests of her seat. She wanted to ask him something, anything, but the words stuck in her throat. He seemed to sense her hesitation.
"You're free to leave,"
he said, stepping aside to allow her passage.
But what about you?"
She asked, her voice barely audible. She glanced toward the empty seats and the ghostly compartments beyond.
"What happens to the train? To the others?"
The conductor tilted his head, his dark eyes gleaming with something that could have been amusement or sorrow. His smile cracked his otherwise smooth face, eerie in its stillness.
"We keep riding until everyone finds what they've lost."
Amelia's legs felt heavy as she stood, her movements sluggish as though something unseen were trying to hold her back. She stepped through the open door and onto the platform, the ground solid beneath her feet in a way that felt almost foreign. She turned back to watch the train, her heart hammering in her chest. For a moment, it lingered, its sleek black form shimmering under the faint glow of the streetlights. Then, as if dissolving into the air itself, it vanished. The platform was empty. The rusted track stretched into the distance, overgrown with weeds and bathed in the faint light of a waning moon. As Amelia walked the familiar streets toward her home, a strange calm settled over her. The heavy weight she had carried for so long, the guilt, the sorrow, the endless questions, seemed to lift. It wasn't entirely gone, but it no longer crushed her under its unbearable pressure. That night, as she lay in her childhood bed, she closed her eyes without fear for the first time in years. The memories of the train, the haunting vignettes, and her own trial remained vivid, but they felt distant now, like pages in a closed book. And as she drifted to sleep, a single thought lingered in her mind. Perhaps she hadn't just been lost all this time. Perhaps she had been searching, and finally, she had found her way. The rusted tracks outside her town never carried another train. Locals continued to whisper about the midnight train to nowhere, but no one had seen or heard it since that blood moon night. But sometimes, when the wind was just right and the night was quiet, Amelia thought she could hear the faint, mournful whistle in the distance, a reminder that the train was still out there, carrying others toward the truths they sought. Life after the train was quieter for Amelia, but it wasn't the same. Neighbors noticed the change first. She no longer wandered the streets at odd hours or disappeared into the woods under the cover of darkness. The restless energy that once surrounded her like a storm had settled, replaced by a quiet determination. At the diner where she occasionally worked to make ends meet, Amelia was kind and attentive, but there was a distance to her gaze, as if she were looking through the world rather than at it. When people asked about her time away, her father's death, or why she had returned, she gave short, polite answers, steering the conversation elsewhere. But in the stillness of her small rented room, where the walls felt too close and the silence too loud, she couldn't avoid her thoughts. Amelia often dreamed of the train. In these dreams, it wasn't terrifying. It was quiet, gliding through the void as it carried passengers toward their unknown destinations. She saw flashes of the other passengers, the man with the frozen laugh, the woman stirring tea, the child drawing shapes that vanished as quickly as they appeared. She wondered if they had found peace, if they had stepped off the train with lighter hearts, as she had. Sometimes she thought of the conductor. His waxy face and hollow mirror-like eyes haunted her, though not with fear. She remembered his eerie smile when he told her, "We keep riding until everyone finds what they've lost." She wondered what he had lost, what had tethered him to that train for eternity. On those nights, when the memories grew too vivid and her chest felt tight, she would sit by her window, staring out at the moonlit forest. She never stepped outside, not since the train. Instead, she whispered to herself, "Not tonight," as if reassuring herself that the pull of the forest was gone. Months passed, then years, and Amelia rebuilt her life. She began volunteering at the community center, helping teenagers who reminded her of her younger self. Lost, aimless, searching for something they couldn't name. But every so often, a blood moon would rise. Its crimson glow bathed the town in an eerie light, turning shadows long and strange. The air would grow still, unnaturally so, and the whisper of distant echoes seemed to hum just beyond the edge of hearing. On those nights, Amelia locked her doors and windows, drawing the curtains tightly. The sight of the moon made her stomach twist, her palms damp with sweat. She told herself it was irrational. That night on the train had ended. She had faced her grief, her guilt, and she had found what she needed to move on. But deep down, a part of her believed the train wasn't done with her. She undid the buttons on the long jacket and laid the jacket in its overhangs. She told herself it was irrational that 9/11 had killed 27 people, that she had faced her grief, her guilt, and she had found what she needed to move on. Beneath had been the weight of the world she could bring to the surface. Beneath everything. Beneath everything she could find again. She would just whisper, on her bed, hugging her knees to her chest, and whisper the same words over and over.
Not tonight, not tonight.
The woods remained unchanged, their trees still whispering secrets to anyone brave. Or foolish. Enough to enter. Some townsfolk claimed they had heard the faint whistle of a train during the blood moon, though no tracks had existed there for decades. Teenagers dared each other to venture into the forest on those nights, spinning tales about the midnight train to nowhere. Some swore they saw its golden windows glowing faintly through the trees, though none dared get close enough to find out. Amelia avoided these rumors. She didn't go to the diner on blood moon nights, didn't step onto her porch, didn't even answer her phone. She wanted no part of it. Amelia didn't share her story, not even with those closest to her, but the weight she carried no longer felt unbearable. Her father's death still lingered in her heart, but it no longer consumed her. The apology she had whispered to the creature in that rotting house, the shadow of her father, had freed her in ways she didn't fully understand. Yet, some nights, as she lay in bed staring at the cracks in her ceiling, she wondered if the train would come for her again. Had she truly found everything she had lost, or was there more to uncover? She had no answers, but she made a silent vow, if the train ever returned, she would be ready, not to run from it this time, but to face it, to understand it. For now, though, she closed her eyes and whispered, as she always did when fear crept in.
Not tonight.